I told you to get out of my sight.
Please, I didn't do anything.
Hey! Let her go right now.
The hand on Emily's collar should have been just another breach of decorum that Dominic Ravello ignored. Another entitled man behaving badly in a city built on bad behavior. But when Emily's breath hitched, a tiny fractured sound that only a predator trained in silence could hear. Something ancient and territorial roared to life inside him. He had burned down entire city blocks for less than the terror he saw glazing her glossy, tear-streaked eyes. Take your hand off her. His voice was a low, lethal vibration, the same tone he used seconds before sentence was carried out. Julian Vane's fingers tightened instinctively against the white cotton of Emily's shirt, the fabric straining against her skin. "It's okay, Mr. Ravello," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the floor, desperate to return to the safety of the shadows. I made a mistake with the order. It's my fault." Dominic stepped out from the amber glow of the chandelier, and Julian instinctively recoiled. That small movement, Emily's reflexive attempt to take the blame to avoid a scene, ignited a fuse in Dominic that had nothing to do with the business of the underworld. For the first time in 20 years of absolute rule, the execution of the East End felt the suffocating weight of a situation he couldn't negotiate. "I didn't ask whose fault it was," he murmured, and the power dynamic of the entire room shifted. Emily had served at Ravello's for 3 years without ever truly looking Dominic in the eye. To her, he was a force of nature. Bespoke suits, the scent of expensive tobacco, and a gravity that pulled the air out of any room he entered. She knew the golden rules of his kingdom. He paid 3 times a minimum wage, demanded perfection, and expected invisibility. Invisibility was Emily's armor. 24 years of navigating a world that didn't see her had taught her how to become part of the architecture. She perfected the silent glide, quieted her footsteps on the marble floors, and mastered the art of being present without ever being noticed. But tonight, the man who demanded her silence was the only one forcing the world to finally see her. The clink of Dominic Ravello's wine glass hitting the tablecloth was not loud, but in the sudden vacuum of the restaurant's atmosphere, it sounded like a gunshot. He stood slowly, the dark overcoat draped over his shoulders remaining perfectly still, a black shroud that emphasized the predatory grace of his movement. Behind him, his 2 bodyguards adjusted their stances, their faces as unreadable as granite, their presence a silent promise of the violence Dominic didn't even need to voice. Julian Vane's hand finally slipped from Emily's collar, his fingers twitching as if they had been burned. He tried to summon a laugh, a sharp, jagged sound that died in the thick, expensive air of the dining room. "Now, look here, Ravello," Julian stammered, his bravado leaking out at him like air from a punctured tire. This girl was being disrespectful. "I'm a paying customer. My father is a senator. For God's sake." "Your father," Dominic interrupted, his voice a velvet blade that sliced through Julian's protest, "is currently enjoying a campaign contribution from a man who works for me. Which means, in the cold calculus of the city, you are currently breathing my air on credit. And your credit just ran out." Dominic stepped into Emily's personal space, but he didn't crowd her. Instead, he became a wall between her and the world. He reached out with a hand that had signed death warrants and built empires. With a meticulous, almost reverent grace, he pulled a silk handkerchief from his vest pocket. He didn't look at Julian. He looked only at the red marks on Emily's neck, his eyes darkening to the color of a stormy sea. He began to dab at the tears on her cheeks, his touch unexpectedly steady. Emily froze, her breath hitching in her chest. For 3 years, she had been a shadow. Now, the sun was staring directly at her, and it was scorching. "The rule of this house is simple, Julian," Dominic murmured, his gaze finally shifting to the senator's son. The look was one of quiet, absolute menace, the look of an apex predator watching a wounded animal crawl. "The staff are the foundation of my home, and one does not kick the foundation and expect the roof to stay up." Dominic leaned in, his lips inches from Julian's ear. The room held its collective breath. Whatever Dominic whispered was for Julian alone, but the effect was instantaneous. The color drained from Julian's face until he was a shade of curdled milk. His knees actually buckled. In front of the city's judges, the district attorney, and the socialites who sat at the surrounding tables, the senator's son sank to the carpet. I'm sorry, Julian stammered, his voice cracking like thin ice. Louder, Dominic commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filling every corner of the room. I'm sorry, Emily. Julian cried out, his humiliation complete. Dominic dropped a soiled handkerchief onto Julian's shoulder as if discarding trash. Get him out and call his father. Tell the senator that his son's debt is called in by tomorrow morning. The Vane name will be a ghost story in the city. The bodyguards didn't just escort Julian. They hauled him by his collar, dragging him toward the grand entrance as the elite diners watched in a stunned, breathless silence. The shockwave was already moving. By dawn, every power player in the city would know. Dominic Ravello had broken a political dynasty for a waitress. Dominic finally looked down at Emily. She was still trembling, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear, the fear of being seen. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer comfort. Go to my office, Emily, he said, the coldness returning to his expression. You're done being a ghost. The air in Dominic's office didn't circulate. It sat heavy and still, thick with the scent of aged cedar and the cold, metallic tang of absolute authority. Emily stood in the center of the Persian rug, feeling small and dangerously exposed. The grand dining room, with its amber light and clinking crystal, felt a lifetime away, replaced by the suffocating silence of the inner sanctum. Dominic sat behind a desk of carved obsidian, his silhouette framed by the panoramic window that overlooked a city he effectively owned. He didn't look up immediately. He was focused on a ledger, his fountain pen scratching against the paper with a rhythmic, clinical precision. I can pay for the shirt, Mr. Ravello, Emily whispered, her voice cracking the silence. She was still clutching the edges of her stained apron, her knuckles white, and the wine Julian spilled. I have some savings. Be silent, Emily. It wasn't a shout. It was a command that moved through the room like a physical weight. Dominic finally looked up. His eyes didn't hold the fire of the restaurant floor. They were cold, calculated, and terrifyingly focused. He leaned back, his hands steepled beneath his chin. You think this is about a shirt? You think this is about the petty change in your bank account? He stood, walking slowly around the desk until he was inches from her. Up close, the sheer scale of the man was overwhelming. By tomorrow morning, Julian Vane's father will have lost his committee seat. By tomorrow evening, his business partners will have scrubbed his name from their books. You are no longer just a waitress who had a bad night. You are the catalyst for the destruction of a dynasty. He paused, his gaze dropping to the faint, blooming purple on her neck. His jaw tightened, a flicker of the beast returning to the surface. You cannot stay here. Every parasite in this city who wants to hurt me will look for the girl who made me break my own rules. To keep you in this restaurant is to put a target on your back that I cannot protect from behind a kitchen door. Are you firing me? Emily felt the ground shift. The restaurant was her only lifeline, her only way to keep her brother's heart beating and the lights on in their cramped apartment. I am removing you from the board, Dominic corrected. He reached into his vest and pulled out an envelope, sliding it into the pocket of her apron. It felt heavy, more money than she had seen in a year. You don't work for Ravello's anymore. You are done with the shadows. But I have nowhere else to go, she breathed, her eyes glossing over with a fresh wave of helplessness. Go out the back in trance, Dominic said, turning his back to her, returning to his cold monolith of a desk. The world you knew is over, Emily. Try not to look back. The walk through the service corridor felt like a funeral procession. The other staff averted their eyes, the silence following her like a shroud. When she pushed through the heavy steel door into the biting chill of the alleyway, she expected the crushing weight of loneliness. She expected to be a ghost again, but the alley wasn't empty. A sleek, black sedan sat idling in the gloom, its engine a low, predatory hum that vibrated through the pavement. The tinted windows were like ink, reflecting the neon grid of the city. As Emily stepped forward, the back door swung open with a silent, hydraulic hiss. A man in a sharp black suit stepped out, not a waiter, but a soldier. He didn't speak. He simply gestured to the plush, leather interior of the car. Emily looked back at the closed door of the restaurant. then at the waiting darkness of the vehicle. She realized then that Dominic Ravello hadn't just fired her. He had claimed her. She stepped into the car, and as the door clicked shut, the city outside vanished. The sedan climbed steadily, leaving the neon-soaked grid of the city behind as it wound through the hills where the air grew thin and cold. Emily watched the blurred lights through the tinted glass, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. When the car finally slowed, a set of massive iron gates, wrought with a Ravello crest, parted like the jaws of a silent beast. The estate didn't look like a home. It was a fortress of glass and obsidian, perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the city Dominic Ravello had conquered. The soldier opened the door, and Emily stepped out onto a heated driveway. The silence here was different from the restaurant. It wasn't the silence of a requirement, but the silence of a grave. She was led through towering mahogany doors into a foyer that felt like a museum, all white marble and shadows that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Mr. Ravello is in the library," the man said, gesturing toward a staircase that spiraled upward like a serpent. Emily ascended, her simple waitress shoes clicking hollowly against the stone. She found him standing before a floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette against the distant, shimmering lights of the skyline. He had removed his overcoat and vest, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and old scars. In his hand was a glass of something amber and ancient. "You should be resting," Dominic said without turning around. "The physician will be here in the morning to look at your neck." "I don't need a physician, Mr. Ravello," Emily replied, her voice small but steady. She stayed near the door, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. The only thing she still owned of her old life. "I need to go home. My brother, he's alone. He doesn't understand where I am." Dominic turned then, the light from the fireplace casting long, flickering shadows across his sharp features. "Your brother is being cared for. A private nurse arrived at your apartment an hour ago with enough groceries and medicine to last a month. There's a guard at his door. He is safer than he has ever been." The air left Emily's lungs in a rush. The relief was a tidal wave, but beneath it was a cold, sharp spike of terror. "How did you know?" "I never told anyone about Leo. I make it my business to know the variables of my environment, Emily." He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. He stopped just outside her personal space, the scent of bergamot and danger enveloping her. "I watched you for months. I watched you hide your bruises. I watched you skip meals to save pennies, and I watched you serve men who weren't fit to breathe your air. You were the only thing in that restaurant that wasn't for sale. I respected that." "Respect doesn't involve kidnapping," Emily countered, her chin lifting in a flicker of the defiance he had admired. Dominic leaned in, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet, suffocating intensity. "In this city, Emily, you are either the predator or the prey. You chose to be a ghost, but Julian Vane saw you. Now, the only thing standing between you and the men who want to use you to get to me is this house." He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw, never touching a bruise, but hovering close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin. "You aren't a prisoner, Emily, but you are no longer invisible. You belong to the light now. My light." The heavy envelope Dominic had tucked into Emily's apron felt like a lead weight against her hip. She reached into the pocket and pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she thrust a thick stack of bills toward him. The firelight caught the edges of the parchment, casting a flickering orange glow over the sheer amount of money. More than she would have earned in 5 years of double shifts. "I can't take this," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since the moment Julian Vane's hand had closed around her throat. "And I can't stay here. I'm grateful that you stopped him, Mr. Ravello. Truly. But I don't want to be a variable, and I don't want to be cared for by a man who counts his favors like he counts his enemies. I've spent my whole life paying off debts I didn't create. I won't start a new one with you." Dominic didn't take the money. He didn't even look at it. He simply set his glass down on a side table and stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor until it swallowed her own. The air seemed to grow colder as he moved, a stillness following that felt less like peace and more like the eye of a storm. "You think this is a transaction," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that resonated in the quiet room. "You think I am an accountant. Emily, tallying up the cost of a nurse and a guard, so I can present you with a bill later. You are mistaken. My world does not run on currency. It runs on something much older and much more permanent. He walked to a cabinet of dark, polished wood and pulled out a small, heavy coin, gold, with an ancient crest of a lion and a broken sword. He turned it over in his fingers, the metal catching the light. Where my family comes from, we live by a code that the modern world has forgotten. It is called a protector. When a person enters my house to work, they are not just an employee. They are under my mantle. They eat my salt, they breathe my air, and in return my strength is their strength. He looked up, his gaze pinning her to the spot. Julian Vane didn't just harass a waitress. He insulted the master of the house. In the old world, that is a debt of blood. By intervening, I didn't create a debt for you, Emily. I satisfied a debt to my own honor. But I don't want to be part of your old world, Emily whispered, her heart hammering. I just want to go back to my life. There is no back, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a secret. He reached out, his hand finally closing over hers, forcing her fingers to curl back over the envelope of money. His skin was warm, his grip firm but not crushing. The moment I stepped between you and that man, the city saw a lion protecting his own. If I let you walk out that door tonight, you wouldn't make it to the end of the driveway before someone took you to find out where my weaknesses are. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. You don't owe me money, Emily, and you don't owe me your soul, but you owe yourself a chance to survive. Stay, not as a servant and not as a prisoner. Stay as a guest of the Ravello name. Let the city learn what happens when someone touches what belongs to me. The dawn light didn't bring peace to the Ravello estate. It brought the cold, gray clarity of a battlefield. Emily stood by the library window, watching security detail double on the lawn below. Black-suited men move with the synchronized, lethal intent of a shark pack, their presence turning the manicured gardens into a perimeter. The envelope of money sat on the obsidian desk behind her, an unexploded bomb in the middle of a room that smelled of expensive leather and impending violence. The silence was shattered by the sharp, persistent trill of a secure phone line. Dominic didn't rush to answer it. He stood by the fireplace, watching a log crumble into glowing embers, his silhouette long and imposing against the stone. When he finally picked up the receiver, his executioner mask was back in place, his features frozen into a mass of granite that allowed no emotion to escape. Dominic. The voice on the other end was distorted by a scrambler, but the serrated edge of Senator Arthur Vane's arrogance was unmistakable. He didn't offer a greeting. He issued a sentence. You have exactly 1 hour to turn over the girl and release a public statement taking full responsibility for the misunderstanding with my son. If you don't, I will unleash every regulatory agency, every precinct, and every federal task force I have on my payroll. I will peel your businesses back until there is nothing left but the rot underneath. I will bury you, Ravello. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked across the room at Emily, his gaze lingering on the way she held herself. Shoulders slightly less hunched than the night before, but her eyes still wide with the realization that she was a spark for a city-wide conflagration. Arthur, Dominic said, his voice a low, terrifying purr that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. You talk about your payroll as if you own the ink. You forget that I own the paper it's printed on. You want to peel back my businesses? Start with the shell company that funded your last 3 campaigns. Or perhaps we can discuss the offshore account in the Caymans that pays for Julian's disappearances whenever he hurts someone less protected than a Ravello employee. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with the sudden, suffocating realization of a man who had brought a political knife to a nuclear standoff. This isn't just about Julian anymore, the senator hissed, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and burgeoning panic. You've broken the status quo. You've humiliated a sitting senator for a waitress. There will be blood in the streets for this, Dominic. I'll make sure of it. Then let it be yours, Dominic said, and hung up without waiting for a reply. He turned to his lead guard, Dante, who stood by the door like a shadow carved from the dark. The air in the room shifted, turning electric and cold. The senator has chosen his path, Dominic commanded. Activate the black files. I want every acid Vanones frozen by midday. Every ally here should feel the sudden, chilling urge to forget his phone number. And Dante, Dominic's eyes flared with a dark, ancient hunger. If a single police cruiser stops within 2 blocks of this estate, dismantle the commissioner's career by sunset, the war is officially open. He looked back at Emily, the coldness in his eyes softening by a fraction of a degree. Stay away from the windows. Emily, the city is about to get very loud. The armored sedan moved through the city like a silent, black blade, cutting through the heavy tension that had settled over the streets since Dominic's declaration of war. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of expensive leather and the faint, citrusy bite of Dominic's cologne. Emily sat as far from him as the seat allowed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched the familiar, crumbling facades of her neighborhood roll by, a stark contrast to the glass and steel fortress they had just left. "You didn't have to come," Emily said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "You could have just sent me with Dante." Dominic didn't look away from the window. "A leader who does not see the faces of those he protects is merely a tyrant, Emily. Besides," he added, his voice dropping into a lower, more private register, "I wanted to see if my men were following my instructions." When the car pulled up to the curb of her apartment building, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. 2 men in dark suits stood like statues at the entrance, their presence acting as a physical barrier against the chaos of the world. They snapped to attention as Dominic stepped out, but he ignored them, focusing instead on Emily as he held the door open for her. The climb up the narrow, dimly lit stairs felt different with Dominic Ravello walking behind her. The peeling wallpaper and the scent of overcooked cabbage and floor wax felt shameful in his presence, yet he moved through the cramped hallway with the same unshakable poise he held in his library. When Emily pushed open the door to her apartment, she froze. The small living room was transformed. A professional nurse in a crisp blue uniform was adjusting a sleek, modern nebulizer by the window. The kitchen table was overflowing with fresh fruit, high-protein meals, and boxes of the expensive medication Emily had spent years struggling to afford. In the center of it all was Leo. He was sitting on the threadbare sofa, his face lit up by a new tablet, a stack of leather-bound adventure books sitting on the cushion beside him. "Em," Leo shouted, his voice thin but filled with sudden, vibrant energy. He started to stand, but his breath caught. Before Emily could move, Dominic was there. He didn't tower over the boy. He knelt. The most feared man in the city, the man who had just dismantled a political dynasty with a phone call, lowered himself until he was eye level with a child who smelled of peppermint and illness. "Careful, Leo," Dominic said softly. His voice lacked the serrated edge of the executioner. It was steady, grounded, and strangely warm. He reached out and steadied the boy's shoulder with a hand that looked gargantuan against Leo's frame. "The books are heavy. You'll need your strength to read them all." Leo stared at him, his eyes wide and unfiltered. "Are you the man who sent the lady with the medicine? And the stories?" Dominic glanced back at Emily for a fleeting second, a look that wasn't calculated or cold, but almost vulnerable. "I am," he said, turning back to Leo. "I heard you were a fan of legends. I thought you might like some that haven't been forgotten yet." Emily watched them, her hand pressed against her mouth. She had seen the monster burn the city. But here, in the dim light of her own home, she saw the man who kept the fire. The debt she had feared suddenly felt less like a chain and more like a foundation. The return to the estate was draped in a silence that felt fundamentally altered. It was no longer the oppressive quiet of a fortress, but the heavy, expectant stillness that precedes a summer storm. Emily found herself unable to sleep, the image of Dominic kneeling before Leo's threadbare sofa playing on a loop in her mind. Restless, she navigated the dark, cavernous hallways until she reached the library. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of amber light spilling onto the marble floor. Dominic was there, but he wasn't at his desk. He was standing by the high shelves at the far end of the room, illuminated only by the dying embers of the hearth. He had traded his sharp suit for a simple black sweater, his sleeves pushed up to reveal the jagged, silvered maps of scars on his forearms. He looked less like a king and more like a man who had spent a lifetime holding up a crumbling ceiling. "He's asleep," Emily said softly, her voice barely a ripple in the dark. Dominic didn't startle. He turned slowly, a book held loosely in his hand. The sharp, predatory edge of his features seemed softened by the shadows, the light stubble on his jaw catching the firelight. The nurse messaged me. His oxygen levels are stable. It's the best he's been in years. Why did you give him those books, Dominic? She used his name for the first time, the syllables feeling heavy and strange on her tongue. They aren't just stories. They're yours. I saw the name written in the front cover. Domenico. Dominic looked down at the volume in his hand, his thumb tracing the worn leather. I grew up in a room not much larger than your kitchen, he whispered, his voice losing its serrated authority. I had a brother once. He was the one with the lungs that failed him. I used to read those stories to him so he could forget the smell of the city and the sound of our mother crying in the next room. The first crack in the marble facade was deep and jagged. Emily stepped closer, moving out of the shadows and into the warm circle of the hearth. The survivalist cynicism she wore as armor began to fray. She didn't see the Mafia boss who dismantled senators. She saw the boy who had tried to build a world of paper and ink for a brother he couldn't save. What happened to him? She asked, though she already knew the answer by the way Dominic's jaw tightened. The city took him, Dominic said, his eyes meeting hers with raw, unshielded intensity. I realized then that stories weren't enough. You can't breathe ink. You need power. You need to be the one who decides who lives and who suffers. He set the book on the shelf with a finality that echoed. I built this empire so I would never have to read a story to a dying boy again. And then I saw you in my restaurant, hiding your own bruises, fighting the same war I lost 30 years ago. He stepped toward her, the scent of cedar and old paper surrounding them. He didn't reach for her, but the air between them hummed with a terrifying, magnetic pull. I didn't notice you because you were invisible, Emily. I noticed you because you were the only person in this city who looked the way I felt before I became a monster. Emily reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the scars on his arm before she found the courage to touch the skin. He didn't flinch. He stayed perfectly still, his breath hitching in a way that mirrored her own the night Julian Vane had grabbed her. In that moment, the invisible waitress and the untouchable boss were just two ghosts haunting the same house. The rain didn't wash the city that night. It only made the blood slicker on the cobblestones. Dominic Ravello didn't lead the charge with a shout or a spray of gunfire. He moved through the storm like a shadow cast by a dying sun, his black overcoat a shroud that absorbed the neon glare of the East End. Behind him, his men were a silent, rhythmic percussion of boots on wet pavement, a symphony of ruin orchestrated by a man who had finally found something he was unwilling to lose. The lion's rage was not a messy thing. It was surgical, cold, and absolute. By midnight, 3 of the senator's key donors had found their private security detail dismantled and their safe room doors hanging off their hinges. No one was killed, but the message was louder than a casket closing. The Ravello mantle is back, and it is heavy. Dominic didn't want their lives. He wanted their terror. He wanted them to feel the same suffocating helplessness that Emily had felt in the center of his restaurant. The final stop was a secluded warehouse on the pier, where the men who had actually pulled the triggers at Ravello's were hiding, waiting for a payout that was never coming. The steel doors didn't just open. They were atomized. Dominic stepped through the smoke, his silhouette a jagged tear in the fabric of the night. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence alone was a death sentence. "You touched a ghost," Dominic whispered, his voice cutting to the sound of the rising tide outside. He walked toward the lead gunman, a man who had built a reputation on fear, but was now shrinking into the shadow of a shipping crate. "You thought because she was a waitress, she was invisible. You thought because she had no name, she had no value." Dominic reached out, his hand closing around the man's throat with the same slow, inevitable pressure of a closing vice. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. "She is the only part of this city that isn't rotting. And for that, I will erase you from the memory of this earth." He didn't pull a trigger. He simply signaled to Dante. The rampage that followed wasn't just a series of arrests or executions. It was a total erasure. By dawn, the gunmen were gone, their records deleted, their names turned to ash. But Dominic wasn't finished. He drove to the senator's residence, parked his car across the lawn, and sat on the hood in the pouring rain, watching the lights in the windows flicker with the panic of a trapped animal. He stayed there for an hour, a silent, immovable statue of vengeance, ensuring that Arthur Vane understood that the walls of his mansion were made of paper against the rage of a man protecting his heart. When Dominic finally returned to the estate, his clothes were heavy with rain and the scent of ozone. He found Emily standing in the foyer, her eyes wide as she looked at the man who had burned the city to keep her safe. He didn't say a word. He simply walked past her, his hand grazing her shoulder for a fleeting, grounding second. The city was silent now. The message had been received. Emily Carter was no longer a waitress. She was the only thing in the world that Dominic Ravello wouldn't let break. The morning after the storm brought a silence to the estate that felt fragile, like thin ice over a deep, dark lake. The city below was shrouded in a heavy mist, the skyline a jagged ghost of the battlefield that had been only hours before. Emily found Dominic in the sunroom, a space of glass and steel that felt uncharacteristically exposed. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was crisp, but the exhaustion was etched into fine lines around his eyes. On the low marble table between them sat a manila envelope, unsealed and unassuming. "Dante has the route cleared," Dominic said, his voice stripped of its usual melodic threat. It was just tired. "There is a plane waiting at a private hangar in Teterboro. New identities for you and Leo, a house in a coastal town where the air is clean and the name Ravello has never been whispered. You'll have enough to ensure Leo gets the best specialist in the country, and you can finally be invisible again." He pushed the envelope toward her. Inside were 2 passports and a set of keys. It was a choice Emily had dreamed of since the moment she first stepped into the harsh neon glare of the city. A clean slate, a life without predators, a world where she didn't have to keep her head down. Emily looked at the keys, then up at the man who had burned his own kingdom to the ground to keep a promise to a woman he barely knew. "Is this what you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the thrumming of her heart. Dominic stood and walked to glass, looking out at the gray horizon. "What I want is irrelevant, Emily. I am a man of the shadows. I am the rot you were trying to avoid. Staying here means the war never truly ends. It means looking over your shoulder every time a car slows down. It means being tied to a monster." "You keep calling yourself a monster," Emily said, stepping toward him. She didn't stop until she was close enough to see the reflection of the city in his dark, guarded eyes. "But a monster doesn't spend his night reading legends to a sick boy. A monster doesn't offer a way out when he could just as easily keep me as a trophy." She reached out, her fingers brushing the manila envelope, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she pushed it back toward the center of the table. The survivalist cynicism that had been her armor for 24 years finally shattered, leaving something raw and resilient in its place. "I spent my whole life trying to be a ghost because I thought it was the only way to be safe," she whispered. "But being invisible just meant no one heard me when I screamed. You heard me, Dominic. You saw me when I was nothing but a shadow in a white apron." Dominic turned, his breath catching as she closed a final inch of space between them. For the first time, he didn't look like an executioner or a king. He looked like a man who was afraid of the answer. "If I leave, I go back to being a ghost," Emily said, her hand finding the warmth of his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. "I don't want to be invisible anymore. I want to be here. With you." The choice was made. The silence of the house shifted from a grave to a sanctuary. Dominic didn't speak. He simply covered her hand with his grip a silent vow that the city would have to break him entirely before it ever touched her again. The grand winter gala at the Hearst Gallery was a sea of shimmering silk and whispered conspiracies, a place where the city's elite gathered to trade favors like currency. It was called the Gala of Ghosts by those who knew better. For the people in this room were hauntings of a corrupt system, invisible to the laws that govern the poor. Tonight, however, the ghosts were about to see something far more terrifying. When the heavy oak doors swung open, the collective hum of the ballroom died in an instant. Dominic Ravello didn't enter the room so much as he reclaimed it. He looked every bit the dark prince of the underworld in a bespoke tuxedo of midnight wool. But it was a woman on his arm who turned the air to ice. Emily Carter moved with a grace that felt like a quiet revolution. She was dressed in a gown of deep obsidian silk that caught the light like oil on water. Her neck, once marked by Julian Vane's violence, now adorned with a collar of flawless diamonds that glittered like frozen tears. She was no longer a shadow in an apron. She was a living evidence of Dominic's protection. In the center of the room, Senator Arthur Vane stood frozen, a champagne glass trembling in his hand. Beside him, Julian looked as if he had seen his own executioner. The senator tried to summon his political mask, his face reddening as he signaled for his private security. "Ravello," the senator hissed, his voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding circle of judges and socialites. "You have a lot of nerve bringing that. That girl here, this is a private event. You are trespassing." Dominic stepped forward, releasing Emily's hand only to place it possessively on the small of her back. The movement was fluid, predatory, and absolute. "Actually, Arthur," Dominic said, his voice a low, resonant chime that commanded the attention of every ear in the gallery. "I bought the gallery this afternoon, which makes you the guest, and your invitation has just been revoked." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Dominic didn't stop. He walked directly into the senator's personal space, his eyes locking onto Julian, who looked ready to collapse. "The city has been wondering what happened to the Vane dynasty," Dominic continued, his tone conversational yet lethal. He pulled a small, slim digital drive from his pocket and held it up. "They've been wondering why a senator would risk his entire career to cover up for a son who can't keep his hands to himself." Inside this drive is the testimony of 6 other women who didn't have a Ravello to protect them. It's a record of every bribe, every silenced police report, and every cent of the public's money used to pay for your family's sins. "You wouldn't," the senator whispered, the color draining from his lips. "You'll go down with me." "I am already in the dark, Arthur," Dominic murmured, leaning in until he was inches from the senator's ear. "But tonight, the city gets to watch you burn in the light." With a simple nod to Dante, the giant screens of the gallery, usually reserved for priceless art, flickered to life. Instead of paintings, they displayed bank statements, leaked emails, and the cold, hard evidence of the Vane's corruption. The shock that hit the city wasn't just a scandal. It was a realization that Dominic Ravello had used his power not to hide a crime, but to expose one. As the police, real police, led by the few detectives Vane couldn't buy, entered the ballroom to take Julian and his father into custody, Dominic turned back to Emily. In the midst of the chaos, the flashing cameras, and the falling empire, he saw only her. She wasn't looking at the floor anymore. She was looking at him, her head held high, the ghost finally gone. The city did not just wake up to the scandal. It woke up to a vacuum. By sunrise, the name Vane had been scrubbed from the building facades and donor plaques of the East End. Julian was no longer a prince of the political elite. He was a number in a high-security intake facility, his protection stripped away by the very hands that had once fed him. In the underworld, erased did not always mean a grave. Sometimes it meant being left alive in a world that had forgotten you ever existed. To Julian Vane, a man who fed on attention and status, it was a fate worse than death. He was now a ghost in a cell, haunted by the memory of a waitress he had thought he could break. Dominic sat at the long, mahogany dining table in his state, the morning sun cutting sharp, golden lines across the silver breakfast service. He wasn't looking at the headlines or the news tickers scrolling through the fallout. He was watching Emily walk into the room. She was wearing a simple, elegant dress of cream silk, no longer the obsidian of a gala or the white of a waitress, but something that suggested a beginning. "It's done," Dominic said, setting down a heavy crystal glass. The clink of the glass against the wood was the only sound in the vast room. "The senator has signed the confession. Julian will be moved to a facility where his father's reach cannot touch him. They are gone, Emily. The city is quiet." Emily sat across from him, the vast expanse of the table between them feeling less like a barrier and more like a bridge. "And the others? The women on that drive?" "Their lives are being restored," Dominic replied, his voice a low, steady hum. "Trust funds have been established, and records are being cleared. The Ravello name is now the silent guarantor of their safety." He paused, his gaze intensifying as he pushed his chair back. "But we are not here to discuss the dead. We are here to discuss the living." He stood and walked the length of the table, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. He stopped at the heavy, velvet-cushioned chair directly to his right. The seat historically reserved for consort, the seat of the second-in-command. "I spent my life believing that power was meant to keep the world away," Dominic said, his voice dropping into that private, raw register she had first heard in the library. "I thought if I was strong enough, no one could see my weaknesses. I was wrong. Power is meant to protect the things worth seeing." He looked at her, his expression a rare mix of absolute authority and terrifying hope. "I don't want you in a gilded cage, Emily, and I certainly don't want you back in an apron. I want you here, at this table. I want the city to see that the man they fear is governed by the woman they overlooked. That is the new rule of this house." He pulled the chair out for her, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than the diamonds around her neck. Emily looked at the chair, then at the man who had torn down a political empire to prove her value. She realized then that her invisibility hadn't just been a shield. It had been a prison. "I'm not a ghost anymore, Dominic," she said, her voice a clear, bell-like tone in the quiet room. "No," Dominic whispered, his hand resting on the back of the chair as she took her seat. "You are the queen of a city that finally knows your name." The gold leaf lettering on the front window of her velos hadn't changed, but the light that spilled onto the sidewalk certainly had. It was no longer a dim, smoky amber that had the faces of monsters. It was a warm, inviting glow that promised sanctuary. The heavy velvet curtains had been pulled back, exposing the dining room to the city, as if to say there were no more secrets worth keeping behind them. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The city's elite had returned, driven by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a desperate need to stay in the good graces of the man who had just decapitated a political dynasty. But as they crossed the threshold, they found the rules of the house had been rewritten. The staff didn't glide like ghosts anymore. They stood with their heads up, their uniforms sharp and dignified, moving with the confidence of people who knew their boss had their backs. Emily Carter stood at the center of the foyer, a vision of quiet, unshakable power. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal that fit her like armor, a single strand of pearls at her throat. There was no apron, no tray, and no fear. When a high-ranking city official arrived and instinctively looked past her for a man to speak to, Emily didn't shrink. She stepped into his line of sight, her gaze level and calm. "Good evening, Commissioner," she said, her voice a cool, melodic chime that carried across the room. "Your table is ready. Please remember that in this establishment, we value the comfort of our staff as highly as our guests. Enjoy your stay." The commissioner blinked, the dismissive comment on his tongue dying an instant death. He nodded, almost reflexively, and followed the host. Emily watched him go, a small, private smile touching her lips. She wasn't just managing a restaurant. She was presiding over a transformation. Dominic sat at his usual table in the corner, but the high-backed leather chair no longer looked like a throne. He was dressed in a simple, elegant suit, his hands wrapped around a glass of mineral water. He wasn't watching the room for threats. He was watching Emily. The executioner had retired, replaced by a man who had successfully moved his empire into the light. The black files had been buried, the old world debt settled, and Ravello's was now the flagship of a legitimate enterprise that the city couldn't touch with its corruption. The true shock that had paralyzed the city wasn't the scandal or the arrests. It was the sight of Dominic Ravello, the most feared man in the underworld, standing up from his table as Emily approached. He didn't command her. He waited for her. "The numbers for first hour are beyond projections," Emily murmured, leaning down so only he could hear. Dominic reached out, his hand finding hers on the table. He didn't hide the gesture from the cameras or the gossip-hungry diners. He squeezed her fingers, his eyes softened by a warmth that would have been unthinkable a month ago. "I don't care about the numbers, Emily," he whispered, his voice a low, grounding hum. "I care that when you walk through these doors, you never feel the need to disappear again." Emily looked around the room, at the light, the people, and the man who had burned a world to build this one for her. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't a shadow. She was the owner of her own life, and the queen of the only kingdom that mattered.